Hi everybody, welcome to today's presentation on OHRP Prisoner Certification and Engagement in Research. I'm joined here today by Jack Challey and Robert Lindblad, who will be discussing the topics for today. We do encourage interaction. At any time we encourage anybody that has questions to press *1, and that will help the operator open up the phone line so that you can speak with the presenters. At this time I'll go ahead and turn things over to Jack.
All right, thank you very much, Liz. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon, or morning, I guess, out for those folks out in the West. We wanted to bring this information to you guys and talk about sort of these regulations and how, as a network, we look to comply with them. And that is a challenge, and there's going to be different interpretations and different judgments of what these regulations are. And with that, we'll talk a little bit about the training outline and what we're hoping to accomplish today. First, we're going to talk about the prisoner certification overview. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about OHRP's definition of prisoner. I think that's probably the key part of that part of the presentation. Really, what are the definitions? And there will be some variance by local IRBs and local regulations and such, but we want to at least bring forward what OHRP is defining prisoners as in the context of research. Then we want to talk briefly about the process for obtaining prisoner certification. And finally, talk about SOPs to determine participants' legal status in the event that a site or a trial does not have prisoner certification. And then Bob will talk about engagement in research, both from an institution and individual level, and what's involved there, and what any and all subsequent trainings may be required. So as we look a little closer at the OHRP prisoner certification, when I first started working with this topic or working in this area, I had a sort of a misguided view about this, and I perceived that it was sort of some extra paperwork and extra junk to go through just because there were prisoners. There was some legal component to it, and it was just a bit hokey, for lack of a better word. And then I guess what I didn't realize is really this is about making sure that a special vulnerable population, and that's the way it's defined by the Office at OHRP, is these are vulnerable populations. Prisoners are categorized as a vulnerable population, much like pregnant women, children, people with diminished mental capacity. That's the way they're thought of, and that's the appropriate way to approach this, is that thinking about prisoners in the context of them being a vulnerable population, and they need to have a higher level of scrutiny of the research being done with prisoners to make sure they're not being unduly coerced, that they are being truly given informed consent, and they are consenting to the research. I mean, if you think about prisoners in research, from the Roman age through World War II and sadly even beyond, prisoners have been abused in research hundreds to thousands of times. And so with that thought in mind, the whole premise or practice of getting this prisoner certification is really to make sure that this vulnerable population is not being untreated or unduly forced into participating without their understanding or agreement. So we worked with the CCTN and the sponsor here to talk about what the expectations are going forward with prisoner certification, and the CCTN does encourage that all studies and sites obtain OHRP prisoner certification, and we'll talk about what that involves and also sort of what it gets you, what the value is of obtaining the certification. And then, so to that point, if a particular trial or site chooses not to obtain the certification, they need to create SOPs, and they need to be local SOPs because there's going to be variance across sites and states and regions to ensure that no prisoners are recruited or retained in research. And really, the take-home message from this component of this talk really is there is a burden to obtaining the prisoner research. Primarily, that burden is going to fall with the IRBs and with the folks that work with the IRBs in terms of preparing the IRB submissions and the IRBs actually certifying to OHRP and subsequently reviewing with a prisoner representative. And we'll talk all about that more as we go along in the trial. But it removes a great deal of burden from the research staff. If we think about having these local SOPs and making these determinations of whether or not somebody meets the classification for a prisoner at every research visit, it becomes a pretty large burden on staff and on the participant as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So moving forward into the definition of a prisoner, and again, I'll admit here that when I first started doing this, my perception of what a prisoner was pretty standard. It's people who are in jail. It's people who are, sitting behind bars and have those, lovely meals provided by the state. And that's this particular definition. That's kind of what most of us are used to. People in penal facilities, people in juvenile facilities, are some way detained either after or awaiting trial. And so in the context of research, it's really sort of easy to determine who these people are. The only they're a pretty captive audience. You know where they are. It's pretty easy to define that they're a prisoner. And so if this was the only definition that OHRP had for a prisoner, then the prisoner certification would make less sense for us. We're traditionally not going into prisons to recruit participants. We have gone into prisons or tried to go into prisons to retain participants, and that's the other important take-home message here, is that by getting prisoner certification, we increase the likelihood that we're going to be able to retain as many people as possible. The simple fact of the matter is our research populations generally, by definition, engage in illegal activity, and therefore are going to have legal complications throughout the trial. And with that in mind, the best way we can ensure the highest rates of retention is to be able to work with all of these people in some capacity that makes sense in the context of that particular research style or that site or the other limitations that are in place. But again, if this was the only definition that OHRP had for a prisoner, whether or not we've got certification would be a little more questionable. But going forward, there are several other definitions of people who would meet the criteria for being a prisoner from OHRP's perspective. And as I say OHRP perspective, you can see on the bottom here that this is cited from frequently asked questions on the OHRP website and directly from the OHRP staff there. So that's the definitions we're going with. There are going to be variants across IRBs and even at the state and county levels of what a prisoner truly is in the context of research. We're presenting what the federal agency is defining these prisoners as. Again, because we're engaged in federally funded research too, and this is the standard in which we need to try and comply with. So this particular definition, when we're talking about now the screen that you're seeing, is probably for me the most worrisome within the CTN. These are individuals who are court-ordered for substance abuse treatment in an inpatient facility as an alternative form of sentencing or incarceration. So in other words, instead of going to jail or some other penal institution, they are sent to residential treatment. If that's the case, if they meet that definition, then they're considered prisoners. And if you don't have prisoner certification, you can't work with them. This is particularly problematic if you're going to recruit from an inpatient facility, because you may be recruiting people who meet the definition of prisoners. And oftentimes, throughout our research trials, even if we start in an outpatient capacity, people are sent to inpatient rehab, either court-mandated or not. And what else is complicated about this particular definition is just because a court directs somebody to inpatient treatment, it doesn't mean it's an alternative to them going to jail or sentencing or in lieu of sentencing. So that becomes very complicated to try and figure out. There's a lot of state and county laws that come into play, and frankly, where that information exists and who has that information isn't going to be abundantly clear, and it would require a great deal of investigation and research by the research staff. So people who are court-mandated for drug treatment that's non-residential are not considered prisoners. So that's a pretty clear and easy distinction to make. If it's a non-residential court-ordered substance abuse treatment and they're residing in the community, they're not considered prisoners. But again, if you think about our population and how many of our participants end up in inpatient facilities, either at the beginning of the trial or somewhere in the context of the trial, there's a relatively high number of individuals who may meet this criteria, and figuring out if they do or if they don't is very challenging. So again, further definitions of a prisoner. Parolees, people who are on parole and detained in the treatment center as a condition of their parole. In other words, to meet their parole, they have to be maintained in a residential treatment program. They're considered prisoners. So very similar to what the definition previously was. People who are, as a condition of their parole, in inpatient treatment, and if they leave, they would violate their parole, are considered prisoners. Whereas parolees who are living in the community but may be sentenced to community supervised monitoring, may be sentenced to outpatient treatment or IOP or something of that nature, are not considered prisoners. So again, the last two slides here really key on residential, and not only that they're in residential treatment, but that that residential treatment is in lieu of being in jail, either as a parolee or as initial sentencing. This situation we're going to talk about now, this particular definition, to me is the most worrisome. It's probably the least likely to happen with all of our research subjects, but it's the most worrisome. And let me give you the definition first, and then we'll talk a little bit about what I think it means. This is probationers. This is people who are on house arrest, wearing ankle bracelets, awaiting trial, some other sort of pretrial confinement or pretrial period. It's somehow they're involved in the legal system and being monitored by the legal system. The key to this, and we got this guidance directly from Dr. Gorey. This actually didn't come from the website. We got it from Dr. Julia Gorey, who's the head of the OHRP prisoner certification group at OHRP. She gave us these important nuggets that are listed below that help us really determine whether these people are prisoners or not. And the key is, if this person was escorted to the treatment facility and has to be escorted to and from the treatment facility, they're a prisoner. If they do not require an escort, even if they're wearing an ankle bracelet, on probation, on house arrest, or whatever the case may be, they're not a prisoner. Why this concerns me is when I first heard about this, I put myself in the shoes of a research coordinator or a research assistant, or even the PI at a site, whoever's dealing with this participant. You go up to the front of the CTP or wherever the research site is, and somebody has checked this person in, and you take them back and you do your research visit with them. How am I to know if the person sitting next to them was their parole officer, was some other penal escort whose job it is to escort people back and forth, or did the parole officer drop them off at the door and is going to pick them up at 2:30? How do I know that just based upon this person sitting in front of me? So there's somebody who's sitting right in front of me who has no obvious signs of being a prisoner. They're not in an inpatient facility that might meet this definition. And again, I think it's going to be relatively rare, but you have to have the ability to determine that person is not a prisoner. And that becomes very labor intensive. And I think that the rationale here is, what's great about all of these definitions, if you obtain the prisoner certification, all of this becomes moot. It's irrelevant because you can deal with people who meet the definition as a prisoner just as you would anybody else in your research trial by obtaining that certification. The people who are not requiring an escort are not prisoners, but again, that's not going to be, at least from my perspective, transparent, and you're going to have to determine how your state, how your county handles this. Are there periods where people would be escorted? Who does that escorting? How would you know? How would you figure that out? There's a lot of work involved with this. And there's one more definition we're going to talk about that certainly comes into play with our population as well. And that's individuals who have been involuntarily committed to an institution for psychiatric reasons or mental health reasons as an alternative to criminal prosecution or incarceration. So the key here is there's so much comorbidity with mental health and substance abuse issues. If somebody is, Bellevue is a hospital within the CTN, and it's got a pretty famous reputation for their mental health work. If somebody is committed to Bellevue, and you've lost them from a research perspective, you may know where they are now, but if they've been committed in lieu of criminal prosecution or going to jail for psychiatric reasons, again, they meet the definition of prisoner. You wouldn't be able to work with those individuals, even though you finally know where they are, and even Bellevue is giving you access to them. So again, individuals who have been voluntarily admitted to an institution for psychiatric illness or civilly committed. The important thing to think about is civilly committed is, let's say, you have an elderly family member who's got dementia or you believe has dementia, is no longer capable of taking care of themselves or maybe a risk to themselves or others. They could be court-ordered to a non-penal institution or to an inpatient psychiatric unit. They would not be considered prisoners because it happened through a civil court process, not a criminal court process. Again, this is very complicated. I like to talk about a lot of these definitions as shades of gray within shades of gray, and that's what makes it so challenging and so tricky. So sort of summing up the definitions and talking about making these determinations and figuring out if somebody meets the status the definition to be a prisoner status from a research OHRP perspective, it's going to be very challenging. It's going to be very labor intensive. It's going to require knowing not only what these OHRP definitions are, but how that works and how that meshes with the local and the state and county laws, how your system works. For example, we know within the CTN that the sites down in South Carolina don't have an issue with the court mandated for inpatient substance abuse treatment because as a state they don't do that. They actually offer those services within the prisons themselves. So they don't have a situation where somebody is an inpatient and could be considered a prisoner because their court mandated there in lieu of incarceration. So that makes it easier for them. It's part of the reason they didn't obtain certification in one of our recent research trials. But there may be other states or counties who have that same thing. You're going to have to do the legwork and sort of figure that out. And we can figure those things out on a case-by-case basis. Now, in that circumstance, they still had to put in a local SOP to figure out if somebody was on house arrest or in met some of the other definitions of a prisoner, how they would determine that at each research visit and not work with people who are in a prisoner status because they didn't have the certification. So, the other thing is the client's legal status may not be clear. It may not be clear to the client. It may not be clear to you as somebody who's trying to get information from the client. They may not be reliable sources for this for a variety of reasons. One, because they could be embarrassed, or two, because they just might not know. I mean, if you say, did the court send you here, they may say, well, I was in court and then I had to come here, but that doesn't really answer the question. And they could be being completely honest. So, again, the bottom line here is that what we're trying to encourage, the reason we're trying to encourage people to get the prisoner certification is it takes all this work away from the research staff and the day-to-day conduct of the trial. It adds, and we're going to talk about that right now, it adds some burden to the front end of the trial to get this prisoner certification and to submit the package to OHRP. That's primarily done by the regulatory staff and by the IRBs. So the process for obtaining prisoner certification, the first thing you want to do is request a prisoner review from the site's IRB. This is going to be done a variety of ways. It may be a memo. It may be a checkbox on your IRB application. You may have to formally request it to the IRB chair. You may have to go to Joe's office and bring up some donuts and say, hey, we really need a prisoner review on this. It's going to vary. You're going to have to figure that out with your individual IRB, how they do this. Do they do this? Do they have prisoner reps available? We've run into that situation as well. If they don't have prisoner reps available, what's the resolution? Is there an option of getting a prisoner representative? And we've been using that word, prisoner representative. If you see in number 2 here, what characteristics and what requirements a prisoner representative has is found in 45 CFR 46.304. So that's what tells you sort of what requirements a prisoner rep has to have and what their function and their role is. But it's really going to be an IRB member who is going to review from that perspective, taking an idea of this vulnerable population. Is there any undue or additional risk for prisoners in the context of our research? Now, fortunately, with the research we do, I don't think there's been a circumstance yet where somebody found additional and undue risk for prisoners in our research. But it is a step that has to be done, and it's part of the process of obtaining OHRP prisoner certification. So after the IRB reviews the protocol and the consent and any other relevant documents with a prisoner representative, then the IRB certifies to OHRP. And what that means, certifying to OHRP, they submit a package to Dr. Gorey, who I mentioned earlier, in her office to review the protocol, the consent, a letter indicating that they were in compliance with all the relevant regulations. Oftentimes there's a notice of grant award included in that package. That package is put together by your IRB. Typically what slows down prisoner certification is 2 things. One, finding a prisoner rep and having a board with a prisoner rep on it that can review the research. And 2, getting that package together, because it's not something a lot of our IRBs are used to doing, getting that package together and getting it sent to Dr. Gorey's office. Once it's received at Dr. Gorey's office, the typical turnaround time is about 2 weeks, and we've seen that pretty consistently, that usually it's 2 weeks or less, which is great. And Dr. Gorey and her office have been very helpful and very involved in our research and answering questions and helping us through this process. An important thing to understand, what Dr. Gorey and her office is doing, they're not reviewing the site. They're not, they're not making sure that the site is doing this or doing that per se. They're not reviewing the protocol in the traditional sense that we think of. They're certifying that the IRB did its job, that they properly reviewed this research in the context of working with prisoners. That's what the OHRP prisoner certification is that this IRB has properly reviewed this research for this vulnerable population. It's not about the specific site, but that's why it is done at the site level too. It's not an overall umbrella like we think of as the COC, a Certificate of Confidentiality. This is done at a site-by-site level because they have to certify that each IRB involved has done a proper review of each site involved in the study. And a really important note on the bottom of this slide is that all subsequent IRB approvals, including amendments and continuing reviews, must have a prisoner representative present. So in other words, once this is considered prisoner research, it continues to be prisoner research. Any change or continuing review would require a prisoner rep to review that amendment or continuing review. And I think that we're, as a whole within the CTN, we're in the beginning of sort of a paradigm shift here where we're starting to see more and more of our trials and more of our sites use and seek prisoner certifications. And the important thing to keep in mind there is the growing pains here are kind of tough. As IRBs get prisoner reps on board, as they get used to this process, as they get used to doing this and certifying and keeping a prisoner rep for all the subsequent reviews, once we start doing that, it's just going to sort of be our normal practice, and I think it'll be much easier and much smoother and won't take as much time, as much heartache. It really is hard now, and I understand, and I feel for it, but I'm considering going back to get my PhD, and the hardest part is going to be starting again. Once I do, it's just going to be what I do, and it's going to be more natural, and I'm going to find the time that I don't think exists currently. But I think that's kind of what's going on with this process as well. So there is an alternative submission package to OHRP. For whatever reason, if an IRB is not able to or does not certify on behalf of a site, a grantee can request certification directly from OHRP. This is a little more complex, a little more time-consuming. IRB cooperation is still required. The IRB still has to review the research with a prisoner rep, still has to certify that they have done the proper review and met all the criteria, and we can assist with this. This hasn't been an issue. The one time this was an issue within the CTN was when we had a central IRB that, as a practice, did not certify to OHRP for prisoner review. They did prisoner review, they just didn't certify. But there was a significant time difference between those sites who used the central IRB getting prisoner certification and those sites who used their own IRB and got prisoner certification. The sites using their own IRB were much quicker. So, and just one more section for me to talk about is really sort of the SOPs, or how, if for whatever reason a study or a site is not going to get prisoner certification, how do you make sure you don't work with a prisoner? So really, each site must come up with a local SOP, and the reason this must be a local SOP versus a study-wide manual of operations item is really there's going to be variances across sites, across counties. There's going to be, the way it's done in one place is different than the other. I already sort of mentioned that the Southern Consortium folks down in South Carolina have a unique model that makes it different. We also had the situation for the folks in Connecticut. After they get prisoner certification, they have a whole other process to go through with their Department of Corrections. And they have the Department of Corrections, I believe, has a separate IRB, and they have to go through that. That has to be reviewed, and they have to get an additional certification before they can work with prisoners. In that circumstance, that was going to take so long, it didn't make sense in the context of the research trial. So every place is going to be a little different, which is why these need to be local SOPs. We request that all these local SOPs pertaining to prisoner status be approved by the lead team and the CCC prior to endorsement. So we just know that the procedures are in place to handle this if there's not prisoner certification in place. So these SOPs, what they need to cover is all the research assessments. So the time of enrollment, any subsequent visits, any follow-up visits. We put together some draft language, broad strokes of what you could think about asking participants to try and determine if they meet the criteria for prisoner status. Again, as we talked about in the very beginning, if somebody's in prison, that's a pretty straightforward answer. It's these broader definitions of a prisoner where you really have to ask some questions to figure it out. If somebody's in an inpatient population, as we talked about earlier, just asking, did the court send you to treatment? We try to make this a very lay question, but by then it makes it a very broad question too. So if somebody says yes, the court sent them to treatment, you're going to have to really determine their status based upon the OHRP definitions as well as local laws and regulations, and do a lot of detective work, find out if they were truly sent to inpatient rehabilitation in lieu of sentencing or in lieu of going to prison. If no, then you can continue on to the outpatient questions. If you think about it, even if somebody's in an inpatient status, they could still meet the criteria for being a prisoner from an outpatient perspective. So the second question there, any outpatient populations during the enrollment phase would really be, are you currently awaiting trial, on probation, in house arrest, or some other legal status at this time? And if they say yes, the follow-up question is, did you have to be escorted to the treatment facility, to and from the treatment facility? And if the answer to that is yes, they most likely meet the definition for a prisoner. I personally would go a little further here and ask some more questions, more probing questions about who took you, what's the mandate, where did it come from. But really, it sounds like they could meet the criteria for a prisoner in that circumstance. If they say no, and then they either didn't have to, or aren't on one of those legal statuses, or they did not have to be escorted to the facility, they're not considered a prisoner at that time. And that's the key, is at that time. That could change any time throughout the research trial. Again, that's why it gets so labor intensive. So during follow-up visits, since you've already sort of established their legal status at baseline, you want to make a determination, has there been any change in your legal status since your last visit? So this is a question you want to ask the participant, pretty broad, pretty open-ended. It's going to prompt a lot more questions. And then a question that the research staff kind of want to ask themselves or determine on their own, has the participant been admitted to a residential treatment program or psychiatric hospital since the last visit, so they can try and get at those other definitions of being a prisoner. If yes, if they have been either admitted to a psychiatric or residential hospital, then you want to follow the enrollment guideline we just showed you a couple slides ago, and also the OHRP prisoner definitions to determine if they meet the status for being a prisoner. Or if they say yes, that their legal status has changed, you want to look at the outpatient questions as well and determine if they are on house arrest and how to be escorted, that sort of thing. If no, then again, they're not considered a prisoner at this time. But as you can see, this is something you're going to have to do at every visit, and it becomes very labor intensive. And is a pretty strong burden on the research staff and on the participant as well. And finally, one more slide, and then we'll open it up for some questions. This is just a sort of a general guideline in terms of writing SOPs. You want to make a step-by-step guide. No step is too small. No step is too obvious. You want to write this not just for you. You want to write this so anybody could step in and fill this role. You want this guide to be an ongoing study process, and there's two things with that. One is you want to explain how this fits into the big picture of the study and the other processes and procedures that you do, and two, you want it to be a living, breathing document. If you learn something about the state or county regulations that are particularly germane to determining whether or not somebody's court mandated for drug treatment or some other relevant information, this should be a living document that grows over time and that you add information to. And finally, the KISS analogy, keep it simple, sweetheart. Although in the military, sweetheart was not the phrase they used. We won't say stupid on the call, but it's obvious. So With that, I'd like to open it up for any questions at this time about the OHRP prisoner certification. I want to thank everybody for attending, and really, we're trying to present the broad OHRP definitions, and there's a lot of variance out there, and really, it's important that we all work to just comply.
All right, and star one if you'd like to ask a question, please. Star one for questions. Please make sure that your mute function is turned off. We do have a phone question.
Hi, this is Emily at the Ohio Valley Node.
Hey, Emily, how are you?
Good. Two questions. One is for studies that currently do not have prisoner certification and SOPs were not requested when the study started, are you going to be requesting that we do those? Or what kind of going forward with those studies that don't have prisoner approval?
That's really a question we're going to have to bring back to the CCTN. My belief at this time and understanding is that we're going to try and do this going forward with studies.
Okay.
And encourage the studies that are already ongoing to try and be cognizant of this issue and be aware of it, but not require sort of broad sweeping changes about things that are already, studies that are already in the field.
Okay. And then my second question is based on, the encouragement now to get prisoner certification. Is the CCC and CCTN going to work with lead investigators during protocol development to work so that the protocols are written in a way that can obtain prisoner certification? And I say that because with CTN 46, we tried to get prisoner certification, and OHRP would not give it to us based on the design of the study, in that the TAU arm wasn't receiving smoking counseling at all, and they didn't see that as acceptable.
So in that circumstance, if OHRP has some fundamental issue with the trial, and we can continue to send protocols while they're in the development stage to Dr. Gorey and sort of work these situations out, we'd probably be stuck with the fact that we would just have to either work with Dr. Gorey to see where we get the protocol in a position where they would approve it, or create the SOPs to make sure we weren't working with prisoners at any point in the trial.
Okay.
Yeah, those are really good questions. Thank you very much, Emma.
Yep. Do I need to hit star one to unmute or to mute myself again?
No, we'll just go ahead and move on to our next question.
Hi, this is Susan Sani. So, Jack, one of the things that you said is that sites that are not getting prisoner certification really need to know whether or not they're, people are prisoners at any time. But don't people who have prisoner certification also need to know whether or not they've got prisoners in their study? Typically, that is a question that's asked at the time of the annual continuing review. And if you've never asked the question, you wouldn't be able to answer that question.
So Susan, thank you very much for bringing that up. That's an IRB level question. If your IRB requires to know if you have prisoner certification, how many people who met the definition of prisoners you saw, then you would have to gather that information and report it to your IRB. But from the OHRP prisoner certification and sponsor standpoint, you're not required to gather that information. So that, again, that may be something that the IRB asks you to do for your continuing review or your local or your annual reporting. So thank you very much for bringing it up. But that's more of a local issue, if that makes any sense.
But except for, how can you ensure that you're protecting the rights of the prisoners if you don't know who they are?
Well, the prisoner certification, what they're determining is that there's no undue risk to the prisoners in this trial. So treating them just like everybody else is not putting them in any undue risk as a especially vulnerable population.
Thanks.
Any other phone question?
Hi, this is Alex from the New York Node. I just wanted to know whether there was a certain policy about the definition of police under police custody and how that differs from the definition of prisoner.
So under police custody, you mean they've been arrested and they're awaiting arraignment and trial and so forth?
Yeah, well, is specifically the study that we're working on is that's just one of the exclusions under police custody, and in our study, it's been said, it's a prisoner, it's anyone on probation or parole, but I just wanted to know whether that was kind of consistent across the CTN or whether there's any specific definition about under police custody.
So under police custody would fall into that house arrest, pretrial confinement, rearrangement sort of group that we were talking about before, and from the guidance we've gotten from OHRP, it would really hinge upon whether or not they were free to come to the clinic on their own or whether they had to be escorted. If they were free to come to the clinic and come and go from the clinic on their own, then they would not be considered prisoners from that research perspective. But if they were not, if they had to be escorted to and from, then they would be.
Okay.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
There are no other questions in queue.
Great. And if you think of more questions while Bob's talking, we'll open it back up at the end as well. Thank you all very much.
Hi, this is Bob Lindblad, so I'll start on the second half of this, and this is really to talk about, basically it gets down to the practical question, and we've struggled with it off and on. When we're conducting studies on the CTN, who needs HSP training and who needs GCP training, and how do we make those definitions or determinations? And so we've thought a lot about that over the past, year to 6 months, and trying to sort that out. So I'm going to go through some of the guidances that we rely on to make those determinations, and then some practical things at the end in terms of who would need HSP and GCP training. So the first thing is just defining research, and I think we all have a pretty good sense of what research is. Basically testing, evaluation, trying to gain scientific knowledge, and within the CTN programs is involving participants in clinical trials. So this gets into the clinical research, which is primarily what we're doing, which is with human subjects, and there are multiple different types of research that can be conducted within the context of clinical research, and they're listed below. So knowing what research is, then we go into what human subjects protection training is and GCP training is. So really for HSP, it's that you're protecting the confidentiality and the essentially the welfare of the individuals involved in the research. And good clinical practice, GCP training, is really talking about how to conduct research and the processes that are involved. And for the designation that we're using, basically, if you're engaged in the research, then you should have both HSP and GCP training. So engage in research. There are a couple different places where you can get your HSP and GCP certificates. We do look at those and collect those centrally as part of the regulatory documents as well, too. And so below here is listed some places. The NIH courses can do that. There's the city courses as well, too. And some of the institutions have their own HSP courses and GCP courses as well, and those are satisfactory as well. So there can be a lot of different ways that you can acquire this training. So we've also noticed that local institutions have their own requirements for HSP and GCP training, and some institutions require that be conducted on a yearly or every 2-year basis. For the CTN, we just require that it be conducted once at the onset of the study, or that you have evidence of HSP or GCP training. That's adequate for the length of the study, and may not be adequate for certain institutions in their IRBs. So you always have to make sure that you're compliant with your own IRB or your own institution. But for the purposes of the CTN trials, having documentation of training once during the trial is adequate. So it's also recognized that training has a cost associated with it. Not only some of the courses are free, like the NIH courses, some have costs associated with them as well. But there's also time involved with it, too. I've actually done both HSP and GCP training, and for me, the HSP took a little under 2 hours, and the GCP training was closer to 4 hours, 3 hours. So there is time and effort involved, and sometimes costs if you're paying for a commercial course. But I think there's also benefits, and a lot of times we view it as a burden, but I think if you have an interest in being involved in research and participating within the CTN, that it behooves all of us to have HSP and GCP training as just sort of basic requirements. So instead of viewing it as a burden, I think it's really just part of the education that we can all benefit from to be better researchers in general. So there's some definitions that NIH has put forward in terms of key personnel and people that are more than minimally involved in the research. This helps guide us in terms of who needs HSP training and GCP training. But even these definitions got a little bit gray as well, too. Certainly people that are on the investigator agreement or part of the 1572 are considered designated as involved in the research and would need HSP and GCP training. So I put up the HHS.gov webpage where there's a guidance document that talks about the engagement of institutions in human subject research. And one of the interesting things about this is the OHRP guidances really talk about engagement of institutions, but not so much about engagement of individuals. And so we've had to take the principles of what makes an engaged institution and sort of bring that down to the individual level. So some of the things that describe what institution is engaged is an institution that has a HHS award to support human subjects research, and if their employees intervene or interact with living individuals for research purposes, obtain private information. So there are things that we would commonly think of that would be associated with doing clinical research, and certainly within the realm of what we do in the CTN. Where it gets a little difficult is when they have definitions of people that intervene or interact with living individuals. We can think of situations where somebody may interact with a living individual but not really be part of the research program itself, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So other things that are considered engaged in research is that the institution has an associated FWA, and that the research is reviewed by the IRBs. And again, talking about the grant mechanism in terms of funding research is another reason that they would be considered engaged in research. So the second bullet point here, talking about employees or agents that intervene for research purposes with any human subject, again, it's been sort of a sticking point in terms of trying to define who in the CTN projects actually is engaged in research and therefore would be required to have HSP and GCP training. And then the third bullet, too, is along the same lines. So employees or agents that interact for research purposes with any human subject of the research. And that defines what are the research purposes. But again, these definitions are talking about institutions. And so if the employee for that institution does these activities, then that institution is considered engaged. But it doesn't help us a lot in terms of really determining who in a given trial needs their HSP or GCP training. So other clear-cut cases are if you're obtaining informed consent on human subjects, you're clearly engaged in the research and would need training. If you're obtaining identifiable private information or identifiable biologic specimens from any source for the research. So again, these areas start defining the institution's role, but doesn't define the individual's. So not engaged in research for institutions is sort of an interesting area as well. So services performed that do not merit professional recognition or publication privileges. That's a fairly broad term, so if somebody is involved perhaps in research participants, but they're not going to be involved in being identified as participating or part of the publication plan, it would not be considered, that institution where that person was would not be considered engaged in research. Services performed are typically performed by those institutions for non-research purposes, and that gets into institutions like Quintiles, for instance, that may be processing research lab specimens, but that's what they do on a routine basis. They're not really engaged in the research. They would not be considered engaged if they're doing their standard processing procedures. So the other aspect down here is the institution's employees or agents do not administer any study intervention being tested or evaluated under their protocol. So it's not that they don't administer any study intervention per se, but it's not the one that's being tested or evaluated under the protocol. So these become important in terms of trying to define the types of people that are involved in the CTN research and whether or not they need training. So this is another important one in terms of not engaged. Institutions not selected as a research site. So if you're a research site, you obviously qualified as being engaged. But if you're not, and they're providing clinical trial related medical services that may be dictated by the protocol but would be typically performed as part of what that practice would normally do, then they would not be considered engaged in the research. And that could involve things like medical history, physical exam, assessment of adverse events, blood tests, chest x-rays, CT scans. So it gets into the service providers. And I think some of this came out of the NCI world as well, too, where they may be referred from a tertiary center where they received study interventions and treatments, chemotherapy, and then they get referred back to their primary care oncologist who provides treatment for them, ongoing care, but would also be responsible for identifying adverse events or medical problems that occurred during those follow-up time periods. But that person would not be considered engaged in research, but really providing clinical care, but still would provide information to the research process. So based off of these sort of general definitions of institutions that are either engaged or not engaged in research, what we considered engaged in research are people that are really involved in the CTN trials, that are doing consenting, conducting assessments, recording information, counseling, interpreting results of the research. So those are who you would expect them to be. Those are the RAs, the coordinators, the PIs, people that are obtaining consent, people that are providing counseling as part of the intervention. And those not engaged in research would be those that are performing tasks or medical services that are standard within their institution or practice, and they are not interpreting those tasks for the research project. So this piece comes into a lot of the discussions we had in some of the trials, let's say for a phlebotomist. So if the phlebotomist is actually the clinic coordinator who happens to be a nurse and is also going to be drawing the blood on the study, and that person's engaged in research and would require training, HSP and GCP training. If you contracted with your hospital and had a phlebotomist service come down from the hospital or from an outside group, walks in the door, draws blood from a research participant, and that's their duty, that's their standard practice, then that person would not be considered engaged in the research, would not list them in the delegation logs, and they would basically be providing a medical service and would not require HSP or GCP training specifically for that research project. That would be true for instance, the cardiologist that centrally reads the EKGs. That cardiologist is just performing a service where he is looking at an EKG, he's writing down the record of that EKG and sends that back to the site. That decision as to whether or not that person gets enrolled in the trial or how they how the results of that EKG interpretation impact the trial is up to the study physician at the site to make that determination based off the reading of the EKG from the cardiologist. If the cardiologist, on the other hand, is making eligibility criteria by knowing the protocol, knowing the eligibility of the protocol, and saying this person is therefore eligible or not eligible, then they are becoming engaged in the research, so they're making decisions for the clinical trial. This came up in the 37 trial where there are cardiology groups that are doing stress tests, which are tests that they perform in their offices on a routine basis. So if that cardiology group is having a participant come into their office and performing a test and giving the test results back to the study site where they have a clinician that is interpreting those test results relative to the protocol, making decisions on eligibility, then that cardiology group is not engaged in the research. They're just providing a service, performing that stress test. If, on the other hand, that cardiology group is really interpreting the results of that test relative to the protocol to make a determination of eligibility, then that cardiology group is involved in the research. They could even stand as the medical clinician for the research project, in which case they would be required to have HSP and GCP training. So if we look at this last picture, sort of picture different types of people, and the easiest way to do this would be to say, well, a given role determines what you do, and unfortunately it's not that easy. So if you look at the nurse in the upper left-hand picture, if that person is the coordinator for the study and involves seeing participants and taking their history and physical exams and working with them, then that person is engaged in the research project and would need training. If you have somebody assessing a participant, that person would need training as well, too, in the second picture. The third picture on the top is perhaps a receptionist taking information. If that person is directing a potential client or study participant to have a seat in the chair and somebody will be out to talk to them, would not really be engaged in the research. If, on the other hand, they give them a verbal consent and give them information about the study based off that verbal consent and start gathering information, they would be engaged in the research and would need HSP and GCP training. Down below, we have the janitor. I would assume most times the janitor would not need HSP and GCP training, but I suppose it depends on the site if maybe they have some other roles at a given site. The phlebotomist, if the phlebotomist is purely drawing a blood specimen and that's the only role in the study and that's what they do, they draw blood all day long, then they're not really engaged in the research and would not need specific training for this research project. Up above that slightly, you have the counselor who's interviewing somebody. They almost always will need HSP and GCP training. The pharmacists down below, the pharmacists get tricky because if we have a study medications that are maintained in the pharmacy and especially blinded medications where they are distributing that, typically the main pharmacist who is responsible for the conduct of that study in that facility would require HSP and GCP training. If you have a technician that is just performing their normal technical duties of dispensing medications, they typically would not need HSP and GCP training. Then you have a lab tech on the far right that is just processing lab specimens. Even if they're quote-unquote research lab specimens, they're doing their normal duty processing specimens and typically would not be engaged in research or not require HSP and GCP training. So what I've tried to do is just outline some of the general principles in this that we're going on in terms of looking at that. We will look at delegation logs. We will try and coordinate all this so that across all the projects we have fairly consistent definitions and interpretations of who's engaged and who isn't engaged. At the end of the day, anybody that takes HSP and GCP, I don't view that as a negative thing. I think it's a positive thing, especially if they're involved in an area where research is being conducted and it's a good educational exercise for them. So I wouldn't look at it as punitive. And the second thing is just make sure that you're compliant with your local obligations from your IRB in terms of how frequently you need to take them. For the CTN purposes, having it once on file for us is adequate. Thanks.
Does anybody have any questions at this time?
Again, that's *1 if you'd like to ask a question. Please make sure that your mute function is turned off. *1 for questions. We do have a few phone questions.
Hi, this is Emily in Ohio Valley.
Hey, Emily.
Hi. If a study, back to the central cardiologist question, if there was a study, because this happened in CTN 29, where the central cardiologist was going to have a strong weigh-in on eligibility, would it be the lead team's responsibility to ensure that they have the training completed, or would that be something the CCC would handle?
CCC would collect the documents, but the site would not be certified until they had their HSP and GCP training in hand.
Right, but I'm talking about like a central cardiologist.
Right.
Because in CTN 29, we used the central cardiologist, and he determined for the cardiology criteria whether or not somebody was eligible.
Right. So, I mean, again, you can look at some gray areas, and that's where it gets a little more difficult. So they have an EKG reading, and if it's objective criteria on the EKG, like it's based off a PR interval or QT interval that is being read, and that provides that definition of eligibility, then again, I don't think that person's engaged in the research. He's just providing the actual physical readings from that EKG. If he's looking at the EKG and makes a statement that I don't believe there are any contraindications to participating in the trial, that becomes a grayer area where he's making sort of a medical judgment based off of the facts of the EKG. But if he's just presenting the facts of the EKG, then he would not be engaged in the research.
Right.
And so that's why I have to look at that form and how it was set up and structured in terms of where those lines were being drawn.
Right. So that I understand, but I guess the question is, if based on what the cardiologist was doing and the central cardiologist is being used, would it be the lead team's responsibility or MS's responsibility to ensure that the cardiologist completed the necessary training if needed? Because it would be a centralized cardiologist.
If it was a centralized cardiology, we would do that.
Okay. Thank you.
We'll take our next question.
Hello, this is Jose Fernandez from the CTN MEX. Just wanted to say thank you. We're certainly learning a lot here, and that's all.
Thanks very much for joining. We were very happy to have you on board.
And again, *1 for questions, please.
Okay, at this time what I'd like to do is just give everybody an opportunity to mark their calendar for upcoming webinars. The next webinar will be conducted by Lynn Kunkel and Holly Fossil discussing participant walkthrough findings and trends on May 18th. The catalogs were distributed a couple weeks ago. If you'd like an electronic copy of the catalog, you could go to the CTN Dissemination Library and download one from there, or you can contact ctntraining@ms.com and we'll provide one to you. This session is recorded and will be available at the CTN Dissemination Library and also on LiveLink. If you would like to have a copy, you can contact your node coordinator. All recorded sessions are provided to node coordinators for further distribution within their region. I'd like to thank everybody for joining and welcome anybody who has any questions that they would like to turn in after the webinar to go ahead and turn that into ctntraining@ms.com, and we'll try to address that for everybody and distribute those responses to everybody in attendance. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.